The stagecoach had left without her. Eliza Monroe stood in the dusty street of Dustwater, her traveling case at her feet, staring at the empty spot where the coach should have been waiting. The letter from Mr. Harlan, owner of the Double Bar Ranch, had been clear. The monthly supply run left on the 15th, and she could secure passage to the ranch where she'd been hired as a seamstress. But the storm that had trapped her in Dodge City for 2 days had cost her dearly. Now, according to the station master, who barely looked up from his ledger, the coach had departed yesterday morning. "The next one ain't for another month," he'd said, spitting tobacco juice into a brass spittoon. "Boss man figured you wasn't coming after that storm blew through." The October wind cut through her traveling cloak like a blade. Eliza pulled it tighter, though it did little good. At nearly 6 feet tall, she'd never found a cloak that properly covered her frame. Just another reminder of all the ways she didn't fit. "Is there another way to reach the Double Bar?" she asked, though she suspected the answer. "Not unless you got your own horse and know the trail. It's 40 miles through rough country." The station master finally looked at her then, his eyes traveling up her height with a familiar mix of surprise and disapproval she'd known all her life. "Though I reckon a woman traveling alone wouldn't make it past Coyote Ridge." Eliza bit back her response. She'd traveled alone from Kansas, hadn't she? But arguing with narrow-minded men had never gotten her anywhere. Instead, she picked up her case and turned toward the town's main street. Dustwater was smaller than she'd expected, a collection of weather-beaten buildings huddled against the endless prairie. The Mercantile, a saloon, a church with a crooked steeple, and what appeared to be a boarding house. At least she could find lodging for the night, while she figured out her next move. The boarding house proprietor, a pinch-faced woman named Mrs. Caldwell, took one look at Eliza and shook her head. "I don't rent rooms to unaccompanied women," she said, though her tone suggested the real issue was Eliza's unconventional height and the practical traveling dress she wore instead of frills and bustles. "I'm a seamstress," Eliza said. "I have employment waiting at the Double Bar Ranch. I simply need—" "Rules are rules," Mrs. Caldwell interrupted. "Try the saloon." Sometimes Big Pete lets folks sleep in his storeroom. The saloon was no better. Big Pete, who ironically stood a full head shorter than Eliza, laughed at the suggestion. "Storeroom's full of grain sacks, and even if it weren't, I ain't running no charity house for wayward women." Wayward, as if seeking honest work made her fallen. The sun was sinking now, painting the sky the color of blood and ash. The temperature dropped fast. Eliza had spent nights outdoors before during her journey, but never in weather this cold, and her thin cloak would be useless against a prairie night in late October. She made her way to the small eatery attached to the general store, hoping at least for a hot meal while she considered her options. The warmth from the pot-bellied stove hit her as soon as she entered, and she had to resist the urge to simply stand there and soak it in. The eatery was nearly empty. Just a few townsfolk finishing supper and one man sitting alone at a corner table. He was older, perhaps in his 40s, with silver threading through dark hair that needed cutting. His clothes marked him as a working man, but there was something in the way he held himself, a careful stillness, that made her think he'd seen more of life than most. Eliza took a table near the stove and ordered stew and coffee. When the food arrived, she ate slowly, partly to savor the warmth and partly because she had nowhere else to go when the meal ended. "Miss." She looked up to find the proprietor's daughter beside her, wringing her hands. "Pa says we're closing soon. He said to tell you you can't stay here all night." Of course he did. Eliza reached for her purse, her mind racing through desperate options. The church would be locked, a barn would be trespassing, and she would likely freeze. "Where will you go?" Quote. The voice was low and gravelly. The man from the corner table had risen and stood a respectful distance away. Up close, she could see his face was weathered by sun and wind, with lines that spoke of both laughter and sorrow. "I don't know," Eliza admitted. There seemed no point in pretending otherwise. He studied her for a long moment, gray eyes the color of winter clouds. "You're the seamstress meant for the Double Bar," he said. "I was. It seems I'm a day too late." Tom Harlan don't wait for nobody, storm or no storm. He paused, weighing something. It's getting cold. Too cold to be wandering the streets. I'll manage, Eliza said. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. I expect you would, but there's no need. He turned toward the door, then stopped and looked back. You coming? She should have been afraid. A strange man in a strange town. But something in his manner made her trust him, or perhaps she simply had no other choice. He led her to a small cabin at the edge of Dustwater. Inside it was warm and clean, though sparse. A quilt folded neatly on a chair, curtains at the windows that suggested he hadn't always been alone. Eliza stood uncertainly while he added wood to the fire. When he straightened, he gestured to a long bench against the wall, padded with a buffalo hide and covered with blankets. Where can I sleep tonight? She asked. He walked to the bench and pulled back the top blanket, revealing clean bedding. His hand rested there gently. Right here, he said. Not his bed. Just a safe place by a warm fire. I'm Isaiah Doone, he said. You can stay tonight. Tomorrow we'll figure out the rest. Eliza Monroe nodded, overwhelmed by the simple kindness after a day of rejection. As she settled under the blankets, listening to the crack of the fire, she felt safer than she had in months. And for the first time since leaving Kansas, she didn't feel entirely alone. Eliza woke to the sound of coffee brewing and bacon frying. For a moment she lay still, confused by the unfamiliar ceiling and the steady warmth around her. Then memory returned. The missed stagecoach, the cold streets of Dustwater, Isaiah Doone pulling back the blanket and offering her a place to sleep. She sat up quickly and swung her feet to the floor. The bench had been surprisingly comfortable. She folded the blankets neatly, just as her mother had taught her, then smoothed her dress and stepped into her boots. Through the small window she could see the sky turning pink and gold. Isaiah was already awake, standing at the stove with his back to her, moving with quiet purpose. Morning, he said without turning. Coffee's ready if you want it. Thank you, Eliza replied. She poured herself a cup and wrapped her hands around it. The coffee was strong and bitter, but the heat sank deep into her bones. They ate breakfast in near silence. Bacon, biscuits, and a small jar of preserves that tasted like summer peaches. Isaiah ate slowly, thoughtfully, as if every movement was measured. When they finished, Eliza gathered the dishes. I'll wash these, it's the least I can do. He nodded and stepped aside. As she worked, she noticed more details about the cabin. Everything was clean and cared for, but there were empty spaces, spots on the walls where pictures had once hung, a rocking chair in the corner that looked untouched for years. This had been a family home once. About the double bar, Isaiah said after a while, I could take you part way. I've got an old mule, stubborn thing, but it's still a long ride. I won't trouble you, Eliza said. Perhaps someone in town will help. Nobody will, he said quietly. Not a woman alone. She didn't argue. She already knew. That morning she walked back into town and spoke with Reverend Murphy's wife. Mrs. Murphy was frail and pale, surrounded by piles of mending she could no longer manage. Oh, what a blessing, Mrs. Murphy said when Eliza showed her stitching. When can you start? Today, if you like. The pay was modest, but fair. Eliza worked through the afternoon, her hands steady, her mind calmer than it had been in days. When Mrs. Murphy learned where she was staying, her expression changed. Isaiah Doone, she said softly. You must be careful, dear. Why? Eliza asked. Mrs. Murphy hesitated, then lowered her voice. There was an accident 3 years ago. A wagon went over near Devil's Canyon. A family died. He blamed himself. Eliza felt a tightening in her chest. That doesn't make him a bad man. No, Mrs. Murphy agreed. Just a broken one. That evening, Eliza returned to the cabin to find Isaiah splitting wood behind the house. His movements were strong and precise. He didn't look broken to her, just tired. How was the work? He asked. She hired me, Eliza said, for as much sewing as I can handle. Good. She hesitated, then spoke. Mrs. Murphy told me about the accident. The axe paused mid-swing. Isaiah lowered it slowly. "We all have ghosts," he said. "Question is whether we let them drive us." He didn't say more, and she didn't press him. Days passed, settling into a quiet rhythm. Eliza worked in town during the day and returned to the cabin in the evenings. She cooked, mended Isaiah's shirts, and swept the floor. Isaiah repaired fences, tended his small garden, and fixed things around the property that had been neglected for years. They spoke more now, about Kansas, about Dustwater, about nothing important at all. One evening, while Eliza stitched a tear in his work shirt, she told him about the man she'd left behind, Clayton Harper. How he'd tried to shape her into something smaller. How she'd refused. "You were right to leave," Isaiah said simply. Another night, Isaiah spoke of his wife and daughter. How his wife had laughed easily. How his little girl had loved to follow him around the yard. "I stopped living after I lost them," he said. "Didn't see the point." Eliza listened, her heart aching for him. The town noticed their arrangement. Whispers followed Eliza through the mercantile. Looks lingered too long at church. Some sewing work dried up. Others came quietly, women who didn't care what the town said. One afternoon, Isaiah took her into town for supplies. He hadn't been seen much since the accident, and people stared openly as they passed. At the mercantile, the owner's wife asked, "You staying at the boarding house now?" "No," Isaiah said flatly. "She's staying with me." The words fell heavy in the room. That night, Eliza worried she had caused him trouble. "You shouldn't have to face their judgment because of me." Isaiah looked at her across the fire. "I faced worse alone." "I don't mind facing this with you." The words settled deep in her chest. Sunday came cold and clear. Eliza dressed carefully and waited. When Isaiah emerged in a clean suit, she caught her breath. "You look nice," she said. "So do you." They walked to church together. Heads turned, whispers followed. But Isaiah offered his arm, and Eliza took it. Inside the church, they sat in the back. During the final hymn, Isaiah stood stiff and silent, memories pressing in. Eliza shifted closer, her shoulder brushing his. He leaned into the contact without looking at her. After the service, they left quickly. Outside, Isaiah let out a slow breath. "That wasn't easy," Eliza said. "No," he replied, "but it was necessary." That night, sitting by the fire, Isaiah spoke again. "You can stay as long as you need. Winter's coming. No sense rushing." Eliza met his eyes. "Thank you." Neither of them said what was growing between them, but both felt it. Something quiet and steady. Something that felt like the beginning of home. Winter came hard and fast to Dustwater. Snow buried the prairie and turned the town into a place of white silence and whispered judgment. Eliza's sewing work slowed, but it never stopped completely. Enough people still came quietly, grateful for her skill even if they didn't defend her openly. Life in the cabin deepened into something steady and sure. Isaiah built an extra bed frame so she no longer slept on the bench. Eliza cooked fuller meals. They planned spring repairs that might never come. Neither said the word marriage, but it lived in the space between them. Then Clayton Harper arrived. Eliza saw him first at the winter festival, standing too well-dressed among dust-worn people. His smile was sharp and familiar. He found her on the dance floor and spoke loudly enough for others to hear, accusing her of lies and manipulation. The old shame tried to rise in her chest. Isaiah struck him before Eliza could speak. The room froze. Harper fell back, stunned and bleeding. Voices rose in shock, but something unexpected happened. People stepped forward. Not everyone, but enough. Women Eliza had sewn for. Men who had watched Isaiah rebuild himself. Harper left the hall defeated, and the town's silence broke in Eliza's favor. That night, Isaiah admitted the truth. He had fallen in love with her. Afraid, broken, but certain. "I don't want to lose you," he said. Eliza answered without hesitation. "Then don't." Harper tried one last time. He sent men with railroad offers and threats. He whispered about Eliza's past, about her body, about things meant to wound. Instead, the town stood together. Papers were signed. Accusations were silenced. Isaiah and Eliza married quietly in the church with snow falling outside. A small gathering, honest vows, no spectacle, just two people choosing each other. Then sickness came. Isaiah collapsed in a January blizzard, burning with fever and barely breathing. Eliza fought for him for 8 days. She fed him, cooled him, spoke to him through the worst of it. She told him he was needed, that he was loved, that he had to stay. The fever broke. When Isaiah woke, weak but alive, he looked at her as if seeing the world again for the first time. "You wouldn't let me go," he said. "Never," Eliza replied. Spring followed. The cabin grew. A proper bedroom. A small sewing shop built beside it. Eliza's name painted on the door. Isaiah worked again, carefully, choosing life this time instead of punishment. People came to them for help. Travelers, families, a young couple needing a place to start over. Isaiah said yes the way he once had to Eliza. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the prairie gold, Eliza stood on the porch beside Isaiah. A stranger asked where she lived. She smiled. "Right here." Isaiah pulled her close and nodded. "Right here." Quote, and in those 2 words lived everything they had survived, everything they had chosen, and everything they had built together.